Okay, let's talk about the technology adoption lifecycle, also known as TALC. So TALC was comes from a book called Crossing the Chasm by Jeffrey Moore. And the idea originally began with this professor, Everett Rogers, back in 1962. He was a professor in rural sociology, and his idea was kind of to take a bell curve and split it up into subsections where you have the early majority, before that, you have the early adopters, and before that, you have the innovators. And then you have on the other side of the bell curve the late majority and then the laggards. So, what do we mean? So, innovators, the first group, is basically the people who first invent the technology and are directly involved in the process of creating it. And then the early adopters are the people who pick up on the new technology that the innovators have created and start to enjoy it and fiddle around with it. And then the early majority are the bulk of the people who adopt it quickly uh, once the early adopters say, hey, this is a pretty cool product, or this is a pretty cool technology and we should all be using it. So the early adopters just jump on the bandwagon and start adopting the technology. The late majority are the people who kind of wait it out, let the rest of the majority accept the technology or the product. And finally, the laggards are people who continue to resist that technology for a while until everybody else is saying, no, you should use it, this is great. And finally, the laggards say, okay, fine, I'm going to accept it and start using it. So the idea that Everett Rogers had back in 1962 is this is some sort of a bell curve with the early majority and late majority being in the middle, laggards being on one side of the curve, innovators being on the other side of the curve. And the way he saw market capturing the market was it kind of starts out slow, and then in the middle of the bell curve, you're really capturing the market. The company or the product is really taking off. And then by the time it gets to laggards, the growth kind of slows down. Now, coming back to Jeffrey Moore in his book Crossing the Chasm, he recognized that it's not as straightforward as having a smooth curve from innovating something to getting it out to the early adopters, to early majority, to late majority, to the laggards. The curve actually has some gap in there between innovation and early adoption. And some kind of marketing has to be done by the innovators for there to some adoption to begin. And really, once we revise it, we realize that there are actually chasms between each group. And once innovators create something, it's not necessarily that without marketing, people just start adopting it, and without marketing, the early adopters suddenly jump over to early majority. So we think that there is a wide gap between innovation and early adoption, and there may be another wide gap between early adoption and early majority. And then from that point on, um, there may be a smaller gap between early majority and late majority, and there may be somewhat medium kind of gap between the late majority and the laggards. But of course, the size of these gaps depends on um, the marketing mediums as well as the particular product or technology. So it's very important to understand where the gaps might be in your product or technology if you want to scale it and make it big. Um, is it something that can easily be promoted over social media? Then you may be able to not have much of a gap between, say, early majority and late majority because it's just kind of propagating virally and more people are picking it up. And so, whereas if you invented, let's say, a new kind of robot, and you might get innovators to be really excited about it, but it may be cost prohibitive for the late, for the majorities to start picking up on that product. So you may get a big gap before the early and late majority can start picking that product up. So this is called the technology adoption life cycle. And it's very important to understand it so you can understand at what points are you going to have to spend large amounts of marketing money. The larger the gap, the more marketing you have to do. And that would play into your overall business strategy.